Welcome to Bake This Book. My name's Erik Fabian. I'm a home baker and co-founder of Sour House. Today, we're going to be talking with cookbook authors, folks who focus on naturally fermented sourdough breads and pastries. We're going to talk about their books, how they were made, the recipes inside, and tips for making your next bake a really great bake. Here we go. I'm joined today by Jonathan Stevens, a fabulous bread baker who's been baking sourdough bread for over 30 years. His journey took him from being a stay-at-home dad to a small cottage bread business, and then in 2004 founded the well-renowned Hungry Ghost Bread in Northampton, Massachusetts, with his partner Cheryl Maffie. Jonathan is a poet and a songwriter and a very dedicated cyclist, and his bakery has been nominated for a James Beard Award 6 times, and his new book is called The Hungry Ghost Bread Book, an Offbeat Bakery's Guide to Crafting Sourdough Loaves, Flatbreads, Crackers, Scones, and more, published by Chelsea Green. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you, Erik. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would start by saying, you've got a foreword by Richard Miskovich. There's little blurbs here by Sandra Katz and Jennifer Lapidus. People in my community probably know Jennifer from down at Carolina Ground. Maurizio Leo. I'm really excited to talk about this. But first, I want to ask you to imagine the listener has just popped in their earphones. They're pulling out their flour and their scale, and they're about to bake. And you're standing there shoulder to shoulder with them at the counter. What's a tip that you would give this person to help them have a really great bake today?
Well, check all your ingredients. Look at the starter. Is it bubbling? Is it talking to you? Is it ready to be used? Look at your flour. Is it old flour? Is it new flour? What's the mill date on it? How long has it been sitting around? How cold is it? Have you been keeping it in the freezer? Your water, is it filtered? Is it really cold? Is it really hot? And your room. Is your room warm enough to be a place where the dough is going to ferment? And if your room's a little on the colder side, the dough wants it to be warmer than your body does. That's why, honestly, I tend to bake in a sleeveless t-shirt, because the upper arm here lets me know what the temperature really is. And if my upper arm's a little cool, then it's too cool for the dough. You can compensate for that by using some warmer water. And you can also use a heating pad under your dough bowl, but you need a warm place for the fermentation to happen.
Temperature, key. That's what we're at Sour House constantly trying to educate people about. It's easy for us, I think, as humans to just think about our own experience. And a lot of us like to be a little cooler than our dough and than sourdough starter, right? We all live in 68, 70 degree rooms, and starter and dough likes to be a little warmer than that. I like to say it likes the spa life. And I feel like that inherent in that is empathy, right? It's just like getting outside of ourselves and understanding, these little creatures we're working with to help us make bread. And you've got a really meaty intro to this book, and you touch on topics of community and trust and dignity and baking as a ritual. Can you talk about how sourdough baking has changed you, and what does it cultivate you in as a practice, as a person?
It's changed me in many, many ways, and probably other people could reflect on that a little more in detail than myself. But it's certainly taught me patience, which is not something I was born with, and it's taught me persistence. And it's helped me connect with a community in a way that I was not brought up to do. I grew up in a lovely little suburb outside of Montreal, but it wasn't a place where people knew each other, where neighbors said hello, or where you knew the name of the storekeeper or anything. And thanks to the bread, and thanks to the space I work in, so my customers come in and they see me loading bread in, or sweating, or swearing over something that didn't work out, or listening to music or whatever, I've grown to be the village baker, or one of the village bakers anyway. And I know my customers. I know many of my customers. I know their parents. I know their children. I know where they went on vacation. I know when they had a hip surgery. And that's kind of mind blowing to me because it's not the world I grew up in. And bread is what facilitated that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That role of in the center of a community as the village baker. A word that comes up in your book is dignity. The dignity, kind of in the face of failure of overproof loaves and that sort of thing. You have a whole section on what you call folds. You know, when you have a dough that's gone a little bit too far, filling the dough with various fillings and making sort of calzone-like little dumplings of sorts that you bake. Can you talk a little bit about dignity and like how you go about this process of baking? Because I know your big mantra is more heat, more fermentation, more time. You're always like trying to push that edge of the processes. And I imagine you still, even today, sometimes cross that line, probably less than you used to. How do you maintain your dignity in the face of that risk?
I often don't, honestly. And again, you can ask Cheryl or some of my other coworkers about that. But I think that counterintuitively, we all can approach a level of dignity by being humble. We don't actually, become dignified by taking on a big mantle. We dignify ourselves by becoming humble. And sourdough baking, amongst many other practices, is definitely humbling. It will kick your ass. It will say, no, try again. No, try again. Keep going. No, you didn't do that right. You forgot something day after day. So if you accept that and you accept that baking bread is not about your will, this is not some kind of Nietzschean mission to impose your will on flour and water and create the perfect loaf. It's rather about intent. And your intent is, again, not to be the best baker in your town or the world or whatever. Your intent is to feed people. Your intent is to be the servant of the grain. I have a little pin that says servant of Ceres. Ceres is the goddess of grain. That's how we get the word cereal. And that's how I think of myself. Or I try to. That's my practice. When I go in the morning, I open up the bucket of starter and it bubbles at me and I say, good morning. My job is to keep this culture of wild yeast going. And then I inoculate each batch with it. Keep the dough rolling, keep the bread coming out of the oven. I'm just a link in a long chain. And if that's my intent and it's a chain that has integrity, then that reflects real dignity.
Yeah, that's great. I think that kind of sense of humility, if I could put words in your mouth, is part of why so many cool bakers, I feel like, show up for you in things like your blurbs. And when I talk to other bakers about you, you've obviously been making bread for a long time at a high level, but there's a real excitement about what you have been doing. And I think it's really interesting to see somebody try to take that experience and put it into a book. In a world of really glossy table books that, are perhaps meant to be digested with your eyes, I feel like you've written something that is very witty and verbal, and like you open up each chapter with a poem. How did this book get made? And like, what was the experience like for you trying to translate kind of your insight as a baker and this kind of feeling you have for setting intention and whatnot?
Well, I mean, this book has been written and unwritten, a dozen times, like a lot of other books. And honestly, my first few attempts had a lot more poems in it and had a lot more metaphorical language. And I actually, for 21 years now, since we had the retail shop open, we put some of these poems on the back of our bread schedule. So it's a little flyer that sits on the counter. We slip it in the paper bag with a loaf of bread. And on one side is our bread schedule of the week, and on the other side is a poem. And most people have no idea it's there. They don't even look. They don't flip it over. That people don't read things, right? There's too much distraction all the time. They take it home. They put it in the recycle. Once in a while, somebody will say, "Oh, there's a poem on the back of this thing. Where did that poem come from?" It's a weird little poem, or that was kind of interesting, or and then once in a while somebody will come in and say, "Where's the new poem? I got the same poem 2 weeks in a row." The joke around the bakery is that we're a front for a vanity press. That basically the poems are, $6 each, and then you get the loaf of bread for free. So I write these things. It's a little compulsive. It doesn't make sense to everybody. Some of them don't make sense to anybody but me. But the ones that make sense, a little more sense, I thought that they were conveying my experience as a baker. And when I bundled a bunch of them up and took them to some publishers, they just thought I was crazy. It became clear that the secret weapon of poetry is that it repels money.
Which I feel like this is a good time to share a poem from your book. It opens your introduction and in some way it kind of puts a flag in the ground for your perspective as a baker and also somebody who's fought to get your book published. It's a little haiku, I guess you would call it. Even a bad day baking beats merely making dough. So you're a poet in the search of a publisher. You encounter some no's, and then you eventually get to a yes. How did you have to change your approach to make that happen?
Two things. One of them is I had to keep trying. Like I had actually given up. And without getting too deep into it, I had an agent. An agent came to me. And then when I delivered the manuscript with a bunch of poems, it was like, nah, here's a list of self-publishers. And I thought, So I put it aside. My pride was hurt. And a friend of mine said, no, you have to try this again. So I decided to try again without any agent. And the first thing I did was I took all the poems out and I just made it about bread and I put it in a proposal and I sent a letter of query to Chelsea Green. It was the only people I contacted. And they wrote me right back. And they said, yeah, let's give this a shot. And then I snuck a couple of poems back in at the last minute.
A little last minute inclusion. I've seen you teach workshops at a number of the grain events in the country. Do you teach it all out of your bakery, or is that something that you've done a lot of over the years?
Yes and no. I don't teach classes in the bakery because we've got a pretty strict production schedule, and it's very difficult to mix production and teaching. I do a shadowing program. So a one-on-one thing, a person can come and spend the day with me. And basically they have to follow me around. They put on an apron, they wash their hands, and then help shape dough, ask as many questions as possible. And I've had dozens of people do that over the last few years. It's a great way for me to meet people because I don't get out of the bakery that often. And I think it's instructive for people because a lot of home bakers, of course, have never seen a production facility, have never been that close up. And while there are vast differences between home baking and baking in a production facility, even a tiny one like mine, there are definite parallels and things, insights and strategies that are applicable.
I think that sounds like an amazing opportunity. I hope to come up and spend some time with you in your bakery sometime.
Please.
Out of this collection, which ranges from, you have a basic loaf, like a 75% hydration. You use a relatively smaller than typically recommended. I think it's like 13% starter, and then a little saltier at 3% salt is your baseline. And then you kind of go from there and you tweak it in all kinds of small ways over the following recipes to kind of help people start to understand the effects of inclusions or different types of flour, that sort of thing. Is there a recipe that you love in here or something that you find yourself eating a lot?
Sure. The kernel buckwheat is one of my favorite loaves. We only make it once a week. And that's one that begins with a bran starter. So it's all bran, which is a little French trick. the night before, instead of feeding the starter, refreshing with water and flour, I refresh it with bran. I actually do a separate little container, but I put in a little bit of standard starter, and then I build it up with some water and large flake bran. You can't tell the next morning that it's bubbling. It doesn't look like a standard starter. It's not viscous. It smells strong. It takes a leap of faith to think that it's going to push a dough, but it does. And again, in the same percentage. So one of the reasons my percentage of starter, it's about 12%, is smaller than many people's, is partly because of the heat in my bakery, as we discussed before, but also because my starter is more vigorous than most people's starter. I feed mine twice a day. And that's another important point for home bakers, is that you can't expect your starter to perform if you don't take care of it. And you have to learn to observe it and know when it's usable. So you have to give it a day or two after taking it out of the fridge. And I actually recommend strongly that if you're going to bake every week, don't put it in the fridge. Feed it every day. Just feed it a little bit every day. It's your pet. It's your mother, actually. And so don't put your mother in the fridge, Right?
Where's it live by? Yeah,
right.
totally. And I think, the world of baking, there's a lot of concern about wasting flour, the cost of that little bit of flour, and strategies for that. But it is an investment for understanding your starter, and watching it rise and fall gives you a sense of its behavior and its health and all that kind of stuff. That's easy to underestimate. Let's take it, just assuming that some people tune into this and then maybe they're just beginning their journey with bread baking. Can you talk about what is bran in terms of like its role within the wheat berry and why it doesn't rise like normal wheat in your starter?
I like to describe a wheat berry as analogous to an egg. Okay, so the outer shell is the bran, and then the white of the egg is the endosperm, which is all starch, and the yolk is the germ. Okay, and that's where all the proteins are and the oils. When you make white flour, you're just using the endosperm, the white part, the starches. Doesn't make it bad or evil, but that's all there is in there. When you have whole wheat flour, you're grinding the whole thing up, the bran and the endosperm and the germ. And when you break open that germ, the oils in that germ start to oxidize, which is why you should use fresh flour, because the longer it oxidizes, the quicker it's going to go rancid. The bran is complex. It has a lot of the minerals that you want. One of the reasons why whole wheat flour is a little more bitter is because there's a lot of iron in there, and that's what gives it that red-brown sheen. And there's different sizes of bran. About 14% of the bran is large flake bran. The flakes are so large that they will cut the gluten strands in your developing dough. So that's one of the reasons why loaves are going to have a tighter crumb. They just aren't going to stretch. The matrix of gluten is just not going to stretch out that much. If you take out just the large bran, you leave in the germ, you leave in all the endosperm, and you leave in 86% of the bran, what you have is bolted wheat flour. You get that through stone ground grain, and then that's sifted. The large grain is sifted out.
And you don't sift yourself in your...
No, I buy the bolted flour from my local mill, which is right down the road from me. It's ground up grain.
And my understanding is using the strategy of putting the bran into the starter, you're actually, by letting it superhydrate and ferment, you're softening it a bit. So you're getting flavor aspects of the bran as well as like an extra fermented flavor of the bran, but you're reducing some of that knife-like slicing that might happen during the dough fermentation. Is that right?
Immensely. And of course, you're bringing all the nutrients and minerals back into the dough.
That are in the bran that would have gotten left out otherwise. If you do any home milling, you're going to end up with bran. It's a great way to use it. And then, like locally, our local mills will sell 86% or 75% or 85% extraction flours. And those are
Mm-hmm.
flours that have had that bran or perhaps a little bit more by percentage sifted out of it. And
Right.
so you can kind of add it back in.
By the way, I use the bran as a duster and mids as well. So sometimes we mix that with some rice flour, and that's what we dust the loaves with. So there's ways of using the bran, just not in the whole wheat.
And sidestepping
Flour.
some of those challenges of
Right.
whole 100% whole wheat. Yeah, that's great. And then in your recipe for the kernel buckwheat, use white flour. You typically use like more like something closer to an AP like than you would like a strong bread flour. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's about 85% AP flour. And then I use some stronger bread flour in there just to supplement a little bit. I worry about how much strong bread flour a lot of bakers use, and not just home bakers. And some people are using a vital wheat gluten, which is like a, super supplemental thing. I think it actually sucks the flavor out of the dough. Vital wheat gluten is kind of like a steroid that people use. And like steroids for muscle development, it doesn't reflect real strength. And of course, it doesn't reflect real beauty either. And I think it's highly undigestible. There was an article last few days in the Times about whether bread in Europe is healthier for you than bread here. And there were some interesting points. They missed the boat on a couple of issues. But I think one of the things they didn't get is that some bakers are using vital wheat gluten. And I think that's really difficult to digest. Europeans will not be using vital wheat gluten. The Europeans also bake the bread thoroughly. And many Americans do not fully bake the bread. And that is a recipe for indigestion.
Let's pull that apart a little bit. So the vital wheat gluten, super gluten, it's kind of being used as an additive to give it extra loft and the other things that gluten does. I feel like we're in a world right now, the Instagram bread, people want these like tall, beautiful loaves that, have large holes. And I know you have a lot of opinions about that, but I personally prefer to use an AP in most of my breads. I feel like bread flour is more for like a bagel, like something you want more of a chew on, and regular bread should be a little softer. But it doesn't necessarily lead as easily to that beautiful tall bread that takes the same kind of picture. So I can see how bread as it is evolved in the last 20, 30 years or whatever is getting more muscular, more gluten-y. But I guess I wonder, like, you're on this mission of like more fermentation, more heat, more hydration. You end up, you're like, no to the super tall loaf. You've told me in the past, like your loaves are often much flatter than what we see on the Instagram today. But in my experience, with the little bit I've tried, they're very flavorful. But there's trade-offs obviously to be made for any baker who wants to kind of go down that path. So could you talk about the loaf that you're trying to reach and the role that more hydration, more fermentation and heat has in like fully baking it for digestion and for other purposes?
I mean, it's a conversation about form and content, really, right?
Yeah.
That we have about all kinds of things in our lives, whether it's how we look or things we're attracted to, people or music, or what's the relationship between the form and the content. I don't like coffee table bread books because not only are they not made to get flour on and to get scraps of dough on, but they're there. Part of their function is to shame the home baker with what they can't do and they can't achieve. They're centerfolds. They're there to say, you just wish you could look like this, or your loaf could look like this. So when it comes to bread, let's make it taste good and let's make our bread be healthy for us. And if they look good, so using AP flour, that's actually how you're going to get those nice big bubbles. If you use high gluten flour, your crumb is going to be tighter, okay, and not taste like anything and not be digestible. So AP flour is really going to give you a slacker dough. You have to get over a fear of failure and a fear of slack dough. Slack dough is difficult to deal with, almost impossible to shape, and challenging to get in the oven without it, sticking on the basket. And all you need are strategies to do that with and practice. Okay? And I mean, I guess that's easy for me to say because I've been practicing for 32 years. But the only way to get good at anything, whether it's a pogo stick or a skateboard or bread, is do it over and over and over again. So just do it over and over and over again. But slack dough, that is adding a lot of water and letting it ferment and being kind of blobby, is what's going to get you some bread that has real life force in it. And that's what we're trying to sustain ourselves with. The bread has life force, and the life force isn't the life force of the baker. It's the life force of the wild yeast. You're just there helping it along.
A bread that nourishes us is, I think, a great bread. I share your kind of angst with bread as sculpture versus bread as something that we eat. Just to kind of go back for a second to the buckwheat bread. When you were creating that recipe, do you remember how that recipe kind of came together? Like, are you looking to traditional techniques and like applying it to, the grain you have, or is it the grain itself that's kind of inspiring you? How do you get to one of the recipes that landed in this book ultimately?
Mostly I approach it as a variation of the bread I'm already doing. I mean, it's maybe a sign of my laziness, but I'm not going to change up everything. Like a scientist, which nobody's ever accused me of being very scientific, but both my parents were scientists. One was a chemist and the other one was a psychologist. In spite of my kind of rebellion against that, I understand empirical approaches. So when you're experimenting, you don't change all the factors at once. You change one factor and you see how that affects it, and you keep other things constant. That makes a lot of sense to me. I also don't like too much convolution. When I read a recipe and it says, pick the flowers off of this plant and pickle them for 6 months and then take the chestnuts and save the hairy part and put it in, like you've already lost me because I'm lazy, I guess. So I'm not going to make an oatmeal soaker. If I can figure out a way to do a overnight soaker with oats without cooking it, that's great. I'd prefer to do that. So I've got my boilerplate formula that you've already mentioned. It's 75% hydration and 12% starter and 3% salt, and then changing inclusions, changing flour. In this case, we tweaked the starter already, so I wanted to make something with all brand starter. I decided to keep it white flour. I tend to think that 3, maybe 4 variations is more than enough in bread. I don't want to throw chocolate and walnuts and olives and lavender and really expensive stuff. Things that home bakers can do in 1 or 2 loaves, I can't do that for hundreds of loaves. If I want to play with different grains, I need to think about what form those grains can best be used in. So buckwheat is a really good example. Buckwheat's not really a grain. It's a pseudo cereal. It's more like an herb. Okay. Buckwheat flour is delicious in crepes. I don't make crepes. It's delicious in cookies. Personally, I'm not making the cookies. We have a pastry department. I don't find putting non-glutinous flour in a bread recipe useful, that it's not contributing to the texture of the dough. And if I put in enough to taste, it's just going to bring the whole loaf down. So I'm using buckwheat groats. So we just take the groats and we toast them whole, and I put that in the dough. So you can bite down, it has texture, you can bite down on it, you can taste it, but it's not detracting from the crumb of the loaf. And then the other ingredient would be on the crust. So that's another place you can add non-glutinous ingredients, but in a way, again, that aren't going to detract from the crumb. So in this case, I'm using a corn grit. It's a polenta. It's a very large corn grit. And we shape the loaf and we bathe it in the polenta and pop it in the basket. So the corn grits keep it from sticking to the basket, and they give it a remarkably crusty, crunchy, sweet crust. Those are the layers of that loaf, and it's just tremendous. You got to make sure you have a sharp bread knife because the corn will repel a blunt.
It'll dull your
bread
knife. So did you, when you were developing this, did you like one day you just did cornmeal in the crust with whatever bread, and then the next day you kind of tossed in some toasted groats and then kind of started put it together over many of your bakes in your bakery? Or do you set aside some time for like R&D and like make some oddball loaves kind of now and then?
There's sort of an R&D mix I used to do on Wednesdays. There were so many experiments and so many that really didn't go well that I've blocked out of my head, that I can't exactly remember how that one came together, but it came together pretty quickly. So there's another one in there called Hat Trick. And again, it's like 3 major elements. It's got malted barley seeds on the inside instead of those buckwheat groats. So barley's another one where barley flour is delicious, but it doesn't belong in a regular bread loaf. And it has oats on the outside. And again, oats can weigh a crumb down, but oats on the crust is remarkable, and it smells like strawberry shortcake to me. And a hat trick, as you might know, is 3 goals in a hockey game.
You being Canadian.
Me
obviously.
being Canadian and everything.
Yeah.
Honestly, it was named after one of my favorite players. Jean Béliveau passed away, and I had to make a loaf of bread for him. But before I had those malted barley seeds, I had sprouted wheat berries in there because I thought, everybody talks about sprouted wheat berries. We got to do some sprouted wheat. And the sprouted wheat berries were a pain to make because it's so warm in my bakery. The sprouts would go bad fairly often, even getting rinsed. And they didn't contribute that much in terms of texture or flavor. And they were a pain in the ass. So I thought, okay, that's not worth it. And I could just get these malted barley seeds from my miller, and boom. And they taste like, like Horlicks, like a malted, they're remarkable. That was one bread that really evolved. So I, play around with different inclusions and you see what works and what's easy.
As a follow-up book, I want a list of like bad breads, like the experiments didn't work, mixed in with your poems. So you could like just see if it will repel the most money.
And we'll take some bad pictures of them too.
Yeah, terrible breads, failures, just a book of bread failures. That way we don't go down
so bad.
Yeah, and we don't feel bad, and we don't go down those bad paths. Well, speaking of books, like, did any cookbooks inspire you when you were thinking about writing your own book? And like, do you have like bread Bibles that you look to?
There's a few. The book I started out on was the Tassajara bread book. And that's so when my son Elijah is now 32, was a baby on the countertop. That's the one bread book I had. And it's very inspiring. It's funny. It's one of those books that in terms of techniques or ingredients, it's very dated, but it was the right book at the right time. And I like to think that there's some of that in the book that we ended up doing. After that, one of my favorite books, I have 2 favorite bread books. One of them is The Bread Builders, also put out by Chelsea Green. And that book is just the perfect combination of inspiration and scientific information. Alan Scott did the inspiration, and Daniel Wing did all the incredibly important data about heat in a wood-fired oven or the biochemistry of sourdough. And it was just a remarkable collaboration, as well as stories of bakers who are already doing the kinds of things that I wanted to do. And the third book was Flatbreads and Flavors by Jeffrey Alford and Naomi Duguid. And that's because unlike those coffee table books that are all bread, so you ever notice how the pictures of bread have no people in them?
Mm-hmm.
As if bread could exist without people. That's like that sculptural thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just offensive. I'm sorry, but bread is a social product. It's made by bakers, but it's made for eaters, and it exists only in a cultural context. So Jeffrey and Naomi put the bread, in this case of Central Asia, back into the cultural context. And maybe it's partly because I studied anthropology in college, but I thought, oh, thank God, somebody's actually put the people back in the story here, as well as the recipes. And they traveled around Central Asia talking about flatbreads of all kinds and what the life world was surrounding these very specific breads. To me, that's a remarkable book.
Classics, every one of them. I have a art degree, and when I came out of like all my art history classes, I came away with a sense of modernism as like this world where everything is straight line and there are no children. And I feel like we still live in a world where a lot of times sort of sophistication is articulated in modernist terms where people are not present. It's like the thing in absence of people. And bread inherently pushes back against that, both in how it is made and how it's consumed, despite our attempts to kind of turn it into just a visual object. And one thing that you say in your introduction is like, you make kind of an invitation to us by looking at baking as this ancient ritual that we're participating in. Every time we bake, we are kind of reaffirming something fundamental about humanity and how we function together. And there's an invitation to return to real wonder. And I wonder now, as somebody who's baked for 30 years, seriously, written a book about it, what is your thoughts on that? Like, what are you hoping to inspire people when they read your book in terms of participating in this ancient ritual?
It comes down to overcoming their fear of failure, but also overcoming a fear of nature, honestly, because for many people in their kitchens and wherever they are in the cities and the suburbs or whatever, their sourdough starter might be as close to wild nature that they come to that day, or maybe even that week. It really is unruly nature, or certainly a nature that doesn't work by human logic. And you have to engage with it. And you have to engage with it in a way that doesn't have kind of a safety plan. Don't sneak in some instant yeast in there or some vital wheat gluten just to guarantee that it's going to work. Don't do that. Okay, don't bring a parachute because nothing bad's going to happen. It might end up on the compost pile. Oh, well. But really engage with it. That is, feed your starter, talk to your mother, okay? And get in there and don't be afraid of adding water. Don't be afraid of letting it ferment. Don't be afraid of taking it beyond the place where you used to take it, where it was safe. Get to the unsafe place because, again, the risk is almost nil, but your payoff for actually engaging with it and getting beyond the notion of, oh, this is my will and it didn't work out. What's the dough saying? What's the flour telling you? What's going on with these elements here? Okay, that's what I hope people even just begin to do in their homes. And then think about horizontally, where's the flour coming from? Who milled this flour? When did they mill it? What did they do to it? And where did it come from before that? Where was it farmed? Because if we're going to continue to have bread, we're going to need to keep growing. We're going to have to get farmers to grow wheat. And we need a variety of wheat, not just the same kind of wheat over and over again. And we need people to mill it. And that's no small thing.
Yeah, totally. Well, I take away, have dignity about your baking, push your boundaries. There's all kinds of ways to sneak in your little experiments at different stages of baking. and don't put your mother in the fridge is do you have a poem with you? Could you take us out on a poem? Do you have something
Oh,
you could
sure.
read?
Love
Okay.
to. Yeah. Okay, here's a goofy poem called Surfing Sourdough. This is one description on how to ride the wave. With a wave of dough heading your way, standing on that wooden peel, slashing through the steam. Wait for it. Set in motion by a spin of a mixer, stirring in some bubbled leaven, sends a slow tidal bore from the berry through the basket onto the bakery coast. Can you ride it? Don't let it flatten out on you. Time your dive into the walk-in just right. Catch the curl of the oven spring by reading the surface of the loaves. Fermentation blowing through a sea of wheat with white caps on, the plains barreling into the combine, gathering foam, salty from a distant storm. Leashed to the lamb, now pop up, carve the crust of this epic miche. No one wants to eat a mush burger. Hang on at least 5 on this baker's deck. Hit the lip of oceanic bread so that it hears you spiraling into the seashell ear, then kicking out a beautiful boule onto this feasting beach.
The Hungry Ghost Bread Book, till it deserves a spot on every baker's bookshelf. If you believe sourdough is bread, or if you want to be challenged to consider the bread you make today, this book will inspire lots of thinking. I will include in the notes and everything places where you can purchase this, and obviously you can go visit Jonathan at his bakery in Massachusetts. If you'd like to learn more about Sour House, you can learn about us at sourhouse.co. But Jonathan Stevens, thank you so much for chatting with me about your book.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure.